The honourable member for Calgary-Crowfoot.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. So the Liberals' new fund they've announced should never be called a sovereign wealth fund. A sovereign wealth fund, Madam Speaker, is a fund that takes surplus government revenue, usually from resource revenues, from resource export revenue, and invests that surplus internationally. That's what a sovereign wealth fund, by any normal understanding of the term, means. So this government, in fact, even explicitly compared their new fund to actual sovereign wealth funds like those found in Norway and Saudi Arabia. But this government has no surplus, and it will borrow 100% of the funds to seed this. So it's not a sovereign wealth fund at all. It will become a liberal slush fund that will inevitably become a plaything for the Prime Minister and his liberal insiders bought on national credit. So according to the government's own announcement, it said the government will provide $25 billion over 3 years on a cash basis to seed the fund. Well, Madam Speaker, they just tabled an economic statement with a $67 billion deficit without counting the $8.33 billion that it will need to seed it initially, which is in the cash flow statement and doesn't show up as a balance sheet entry, Madam Speaker. So they enter this new debt with an offsetting asset that produces nothing, but Canadians will still have to pay the debt borrowed to seed this new fund. So this fund is created by new debt to be repaid by Canadians, not from surpluses invested on behalf of Canadians for their future. This is going to be a $25 billion hit on the national credit card. There is simply no denying this. The government's own announcements and fiscal update confirm it. So the government announced that the fund will invest in strategic Canadian projects and companies alongside other investors with a clear objective to achieve commercial returns to build the wealth of Canadians. Well, that sounds wonderful, doesn't it, Madam Speaker? Who could be against Canadian projects and investing in companies that deliver commercial returns for the wealth of all Canadians? But the skillful announcement cannot hide what this really is. The problem is, Madam Speaker, the borrowing money and handing it to politicians and their hand-picked cronies to invest in companies that are chasing preferential regulatory treatment, subsidies, and self-enrichment, all done on the nation's credit card, is absolutely the worst possible way to go about building Canada and the wealth of Canadians. The best way to build Canadians and to build Canada and the wealth of Canadians is to repeal the laws that these Liberals passed over the last 10 years that have resulted in capital flight from Canada and economic stagnation. In 2015, this government inherited a balanced budget from the previous government. The New York Times, hardly a conservative media organ, Madam Speaker, declared that Canada then had the most prosperous middle class in the world. Homes were affordable for most people. Food was affordable. A pipeline to the West Coast was approved. Kinder Morgan was preparing to invest billions of dollars to expand the Trans Mountain West Coast pipeline. And Trans-Canada Pipeline, as it was then called, was doing the preliminary work for an application to build an East Coast pipeline. This was what was on the table in 2015. But then the Liberals, Madam Speaker, formed their government in November of 15, and their election promise was to run 3 years of modest deficits to fund unprecedented investments in national infrastructure, resulting in economic growth that would lead the budget to balancing itself. But, Madam Speaker, the very first thing they did was cancel the existing pipeline approval for the West Coast. They did it by a ministerial order before Parliament even met in November of 2015. Think of it if they had not done that, Madam Speaker. If they had not done that, the West Coast pipeline would have already been built. 500,000 barrels of Canadian oil would be on world markets today. At today's price, that's $50 million a day in Canadian energy exports. That's nearly $20 billion a year at today's prices. And now they're having this out-of-body experience, wondering, why can't we supply our allies and the world market with energy? And you know what? So before anyone says, hey, wait a minute, Trudeau's gone, all the leave it in the ground Liberals have been shuffled off to the back row and off to the sides or given cushy diplomatic appointments. Let's not forget, let no one in this House forget, in 2021, the now Prime Minister appeared at the Industry Committee and was questioned by the opposition leader and was asked about that decision to cancel the West Coast Pipeline. And he had said then that it was, quote, the right decision. So, Madam Speaker, these Liberals have been wrong about everything for the past 10 years. Their deficits were not a transformational investment into productivity-enhancing infrastructure construction that allowed the budget to balance itself. Their deficits quickly became structural and have now spiraled ever upward since, and until, it did actually come to a head in the late 2024 session. Does everybody remember what was happening in December of 2024? That was when a projected $30 billion deficit for this year was so bad, it was so bad that Chrystia Freeland refused to sign off on it. Remember that? Remember when $30 billion was enough for her to resign as the finance minister? Remember the wave of resignations and retirement announcements? Remember when fiscal management finally became the focused issue and finally forced Trudeau out? So, the man then, who was supposed to be this serious, experienced, credentialed, technocratic adult in the room, the man who would restore the health of Canada's finances after 9 years of neglect, that man is now doubling down on the state-led, rent-seeking crony-capitalism of the Trudeau years and has doubled that deficit, which was such a crisis for how huge it was at the time. So now consider, Madam Speaker, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. 9 years ago, the government said that this new thing that they gleefully announced would transform Canada. They said that it would leverage private sector investment and unlock hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. All nonsense, Madam Speaker. Their press release said that there would be 4 private dollars invested for every public dollar. Bill Morneau, remember him? He went even beyond his own announcement and said it would be $5 to every one in his speech where he announced it. So here we are, 9 years later, billions of dollars still not invested, no projects done, and the real number of leveraged private sector investment is 66 cents on the dollar. And now this Prime Minister wants to do the same thing with this new fund. I don't have time to explain all the things that are wrong with the Infrastructure Bank. I don't have time. In fact, I really only have 2 minutes, Madam Speaker. Wow. I don't know what to say. Under this system, the government, this is the same industrial policy that failed with the Infrastructure Bank. This system, the government makes rules that kill investment, then they set up an office staffed by Prime Minister's appointees, they cherry pick which projects they don't want the existing laws of Canada to apply to, and then leave themselves free to create whatever future rules or subsidies to force the taxpayer to guarantee the success of whatever project they've chosen. This is what the Prime Minister has more or less admitted himself. So all this the government needs to do to undo the damage of the past 10 years, they just need to repeal their anti-development laws, rein in their deficits, lower or repeal their taxes, and investment will flow. It will flow to its logical conclusion of projects built, jobs created, taxes collected, public services funded, taxes lowered, and people free to live in comfort, plenty, and freedom. That's why we call on the government to cancel this Liberal slush fund that is being charged to the national credit card. Their approach is not free enterprise, it's state control. It is the approach that always leads to decline, poverty, and eventually, if followed all the way to its logical conclusion, loss of liberty. So I call on them to not proceed with yet another Liberal slush fund.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I think is a shame is that roughly 15 days a year, the opposition gets to start smart debates here in the House. Then in question period, they have 45 minutes a day to hold the government to account. But instead of having real discussions or asking real questions, they chuck out slogans, hurl insults, and refuse to have real debates. Today, all day long, we have been arguing about what a sovereign wealth fund should be called instead of the goal of the fund, which is to build Canada strong, which is what Canadians need. On this side of the House, Madam Speaker, we are responsible, we are ambitious, and we are continuously striving to meet Canadians' needs. On this side of the House, we are able to imagine a prosperous future and work towards it. So here's my question. Do the Conservatives have any actual alternatives they would like to propose? Because I'm not hearing them talk about any.
Well, it's a shame she must not have listened to my speech. I was very clear about the approach that they should take and the approach they should not. And it takes a staggering amount of arrogance to judge and to presume what is important to the opposition and that to say that we should not use an opposition day to oppose a terrible policy being proposed by this government and propose alternatives. That's what opposition days are for. In question period, we will ask important questions that need to be answered, and we don't need to be told by the government what questions we should ask them or which of their policies that we should oppose or propose alternatives to.